Also on Thursday, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz released the state's official guidance for reopening public schools this fall. With COVID-19 cases rising in the state, students and parents have been wondering how classes can safely resume this fall. Here is more from Thursday's announcement.
So today we're going to announce the Safe Learning Plan. And as I said, this is a localized, data-driven approach to making sure that school districts, where it is physically possible to teach our students, we will do that. Where we use the data to drive that decision making, but understanding that county level health data has to be coupled with what the physical plant looks like in that building, what it looks like for your teachers, what are the ages of those teachers, what are the localized situation around COVID-19, and how do we build a planning matrix and a support system that allows us to move through a school year with an understanding we may move from different phases. We may be in classrooms, we may be out of them at certain times, but how do we make sure that the localized situation is being taken into consideration and that safety and learning environment is put forward? The state's responsibility is to use the best knowledge that we have, and we are blessed in Minnesota to have a wide variety of health experts who have been working with school districts, working with our partners at the Minnesota Department of Education to provide that matrix that helps make those decision-making possible. To make sure that when we're doing that, that local school guidance is coupled with the own expertise that are in those school districts, to support them in a manner that does those very simple things, and you'll hear these goals, of keeping those students and that staff in that building safe, of understanding which is the best learning model to get the most out of our children, and the flexibility necessary to be able to build a system for the long haul.
School districts and charter schools will be in one of three models: in-person, distance learning, or a hybrid of the two. And this will all be based on local data of viral activity in their region. And the model used may shift based on how the pandemic shifts over time. What's especially important is that schools can make the decision to implement a more restrictive model if they decide to do so. Families with concerns can opt into distance learning even if their district reopens. And teachers and staff must have the option to work remotely. Distance learning was not perfect, and this new plan won't be perfect either. We are relying on the expertise of our public health teams, the compassion of our educators, and the commitment of our communities to make this work. Our littlest Minnesotans are depending on us.
Joining us now with his reaction to the state's plan is Dr. Matt Ridenour, chair of the Undergrad Education Department at the College of St. Scholastica. Doctor, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate you being on the program today. The recommended learning model we learned in that piece from the governor in each district, including ours here in Duluth, will be determined by the number of COVID cases per 10,000 people over a period of 14 days. What do you think of this plan?
So I will say that my initial response was not surprise. I think in recent weeks, the governor and the Minnesota Department of Education and Commissioner Malcolm from MDH have been telegraphing this to a certain extent. And it was also, I think, apparent and clear when recent polls and surveys were released by the Minnesota Teachers Union, Education Minnesota,
Right.
and also the surveys that were conducted by the Minnesota Department of Education, wherein we had some inconsistency in terms of preferences. The Teachers Union, I think a plurality of teachers who responded to that survey expressed an interest in beginning the school year with distance learning, whereas the majority of parents who responded to the MDE survey expressed a desire to see students back to school. As a result, with people across the board and with people in the state, counties in the state, districts in the state experiencing COVID infection rates at a different level, it made sense to have an approach like this. Therefore, it was not a surprise.
Do you think the governor and Lieutenant Governor Matt put some people at ease who might be afraid to either go to work in the schools, staff, teachers, or parents sending their children there?
I think this plan is not without its concern, and so I don't want to minimize or set aside concern that people may have. I think if you live in Hennepin County right now, you've got a different response than in St. Louis County. I checked today, and and given the metrics that the governor and MDE and MDH reported, at this point, the most recent numbers suggest that we would fall, St. Louis County and the Northland would fall within the range of having students in person in classes, whereas Hennepin County is outside of that range. So to your question, I think it's increased anxiety in some parts of the state and decreased anxiety in other parts. I do want to note and highlight that the governor was clear that these are suggestions and not a mandate. And so those ranges, those 5 ranges that your viewers will see are simply a starting point for conversations between the superintendent and school board and other stakeholders. When
I was watching what they were saying down in St. Paul, I got the feeling that no matter where you live, what school district you live in, this is going to be very fluid. I mean, in each community, it could change overnight.
By nature, it has to be. I think the nature of COVID is that we have overnight an increased number of cases. Take, for example, St. Louis County today reported 18 cases, which is a record number for us, whereas cases had been on the decline in recent days. And so the nature of the pandemic requires a flexible plan. I think that's what the governor and other stakeholders have given us.
Traditionally, I would suspect that in-class learning does better for the student. They learn better if they're actually in class with teachers, other kids, than staying at home watching a computer.
There's no doubt, and I don't think I've talked with an educator or an administrator who prefers distance learning, at least for children, over seated instruction. And I think we also have to recognize the fact that Minnesota is of concern relative to our opportunity and achievement gap in this state. Students of color, our indigenous students, students from lower socioeconomic strata are experiencing education in a different way here. The consequence of which in a pandemic is that it's just exacerbated. And so for those reasons too, the preference of course is to have students in seated instruction with teachers who are doing what they were trained to do.
Doctor, you have students in local schools. Do you feel that they'll be safe in the school?
I think the word safe is a difficult one. I think I was a whitewater rafting and mountaineering guide for many years, and we avoided the word safe. Instead, we talked about managing risk. And I feel comfortable that given the training and the work that's been done in our local districts, I feel comfortable in saying that teachers and administrators, superintendents, and school boards are doing the work to manage the risk.
What kind of feedback do you think the governor and lieutenant governor have been getting from teachers across the state and from parents in the state?
I listened today as teachers and parents responded on social media and other places to the governor's plan, and I think it's across the board, right? And again, I think it's probably has a fair amount to do with where you live and what your experience with school has been up to this point. But I have no doubt that they've taken into consideration those voices, and I know that now as that responsibility and that decision making is delegated to local authorities, I certainly hope that they'll listen to their constituency as well.
Part of the enjoyment of going to school is being able to connect with extracurricular activities, sports, other things, theater. Is that gone for a while?
Well, we do know, of course, that school is the context in which social relationships begin, and we know that learning is a social thing in many ways, in terms of the relationship between a teacher and a student, and also in terms of the relationships that are developed between students. I, in my own life with my own children, have noticed that we've begun to find alternatives for that. And so I prefer to think about it not as gone as much as creative solutions are born out of difficult situations. With that said, certainly a return to school, even if in this county and in the Northland in particular, students return to seated instruction, it won't look the same. We know certain co-curricular, extracurricular activities won't be able to happen, or maybe pushed to different times.
And things may change the moment they leave the house. I'm thinking in terms of maybe school school busing. There has to be social distancing, i.e. less kids on school buses.
Without a doubt, and this is both a cost concern and a health concern first, but a cost concern second. A recent study noted that probably the most safe form of busing students is one student in each row, alternating seats and diagonally also distant. That means that in a bus that may have typically seated 72 to 77 students, you can have just a handful, maybe over a dozen. So there are transportation concerns on top of this. And that's why, again, back to this idea that the governor is offering this as a baseline for decision making, considering that there may be financial issues and others that complicate the decision.
Yeah, it'll be a big thing when school reopens here in both Minnesota and Wisconsin this fall. Dr. Matt Ridenour, thank you very kindly.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.